Hello, Wonderhussy here, about to go check out an old historic cabin that once belonged to a guy named Jack Longstreet. You might recognize the name Longstreet from the casino I made a video about last week, but just who was Jack Longstreet? Well, he was a lot of things. Prospector, homesteader, cattle rancher, saloon keeper, horse thief, and most famously, gunfighter, who roamed all over this part of the American Southwest back in the late 1800s, which was just as the American frontier was ending. Okay, the American frontier was said to have officially ended. I guess that means all the land was claimed and or settled in 1890, which was right in the middle of Jack Longstreet's life. But Jack Longstreet continued to live the life of a wild frontiersman decades after the official end of the frontier. And so I think that's kind of why he's remembered and mythologized today, because, well, he kind of spent his whole life living out every man's fantasy. And by that time, most men had been neutered by the soft beds, running water, and electricity of city life. Well, not Jack Longstreet. He spent his entire 90-plus year life living in a series of rustic old cabins in the mountains and deserts of central and southern Nevada until he finally died in 1928. But he would occasionally go into town, and that's when his legend really grew. Part of what made him such a legendary figure was his physical appearance. Okay, he was almost 6 feet tall, which I guess back in those days was really tall, and he had long blonde hair that turned white when he got older, and ice blue eyes. As a matter of fact, if you look at a picture of him towards the end of his life, he kind of looks like a grumpy Kenny Rogers. But I guess he was feared and respected because of his relative height and his skill with a 6-gun. There isn't a whole lot of information about Jack Longstreet out there. I mean, mostly because he lived his life kind of under the radar, but also, well, it's not like there was a bunch of newspapers in this part of the country back in those days. I mean, he lived to be something like 93 years old, but we don't know anything about the whole first half of his life. He only shows up in the public record out west around 1880. And even then, the stories are conflicting. Now, according to this sign out at Ash Meadows, and according to the plaque in front of the Longstreet Casino, Jack Longstreet was an honorable gunfighter who protected the Indians and stood up for the little guy. But somebody sent me this old newspaper from Las Vegas in 1969, and according to this article, and another article I was able to find online from the Pahrump Valley Times from the same era, Jack Longstreet was nothing but a low-down, no-good, dirty, rotten, cattle-rustling, horse-thieving scoundrel who stole from his guests and pushed his Indian wife out into gunfire to save his own skin. Almost 100 years after his death, it's hard to know the truth about Jack Longstreet, but somebody did write a book about him, and somebody was kind enough to send it to me. And I actually read the whole thing, and after reading this book, and both articles, and this signboard, and the plaque in front of the casino, well, I think I have a pretty good idea of just what kind of person Jack Longstreet really was. And even though he didn't leave much of a historical record behind, we can at least check out this cabin he used to live in out here at Ash Meadows. Okay, I got almost all my information about Jack Longstreet from this book, Jack Longstreet, Last of the Desert Frontiersman, by Sally Zanjani. And I'll put a link to the book in the description to this video so you can order a copy and read it for yourself if you want. Anyway, according to her research, Jack Longstreet was probably born around 1834 in Louisiana. That's right, he spoke with a soft southern accent, and he even claimed to be related to, I guess there was a Confederate general named Longstreet. Although the Longstreet family records back east don't make any mention of some crazy gunfighter relative out west. But I guess he was fairly well-spoken, and he could read and write at least a little bit, which was more than 99% of the other bad hombres living out here in this part of the country at that time. So who knows? Maybe he really was from some fancy family back east. Anyway, like I said earlier, he doesn't really show up in the public record until he appears out west in Arizona in like the late 1870s, down in El Dorado, on the Colorado River, near where the Hoover Dam is today. I guess he did some mining and prospecting down there. But of course, there was all kinds of legends and mythology, even in his lifetime, about where he'd come from and what he'd done before he came out west. Some said he was a Pony Express rider. Some said he'd been a mercenary for the Confederate Army in the Civil War. Some even said he'd ridden with Billy the Kid. Basically, all kinds of outlandish, Wild West dime store novel claims. So, while we'll never know what all exactly Jack Longstreet got up to before he came out west, one thing's for certain. We do know that he always wore his hair long, like Kenny Rogers, to cover up the fact that one of his ears was half cut off. That's right, legend has it that when he was a young whippersnapper in Texas, he was busted for cattle rustling, or horse stealing, or something, I don't know. The rest of the guys in the gang were hanged, but Jack was only 14, so they let him off easy by just cutting off half his ear to mark him for the rest of his life as a thief. Anyway, so most of what we know about Jack Longstreet happened in the late 1800s and early 1900s. He basically spent the whole second half of his life ranching and prospecting and mining and running saloons and drugstores in a bunch of different mining camps all over southern and central Nevada. But it's hard to tell from the historical record exactly what kind of a guy he really was. I mean, these newspaper articles are from the 1960s, when there were still people alive who conceivably knew him when he was alive, and they paint him out to be a pretty bad hombre. But then, you know, the sign here and the plaque at the Longstreet Casino that was erected by the Clampers make him out to be a modern-day Robin Hood. So who knows? Was he a jerk? Was he Robin Hood? Was he maybe a little bit of both? I mean, there's one quote in this book from a guy who was a contemporary of Jack Longstreet and who actually knew him. And I don't remember exactly what the quote was, but, well, it doesn't make him out to be a very nice or good person. And, I mean, as favorable as this book is towards Jack Longstreet, even Sally Zanjani doesn't try to sugarcoat things. I mean, she talks a lot about how, well, I guess Jack Longstreet just loves stealing horses. But I guess that's just the way life was back then. I mean, this was the very end of the American frontier. And in fact, even after the frontier officially ended, this part of the country, this was like the last part of the country that was settled because nobody wanted to live here. I'm talking about kind of central Nevada, southern Nevada, the northern Mojave Desert, east of Death Valley. This was wild, no man's land until, gosh, probably, well, right around the time Jack Longstreet died. And because it was so wild and unpoliced, well, I guess it became sort of a haven for gamblers and smugglers and thieves and murderers. And some might say that tradition carries on to this very day. So yeah, he was quick with a gun, he liked to drink, and he was prone to stealing horses. And according to the newspaper articles I read, more than that, apparently he operated, well, what they called a hostelry, which I guess is sort of like a hostel, like a place people who are traveling through the area could stay overnight. And apparently he liked to steal things from his guests. But according to the book, he wasn't all bad because, well, at least one of the people he was said to have killed maybe deserved it. I mean, I guess he killed this guy, Alexander Dry, and then stole his ranch. Well, when I read about it in this old newspaper, I thought, oh gosh, how terrible, he killed this innocent rancher. But then I read about it in this book, and she goes into considerably more detail, and apparently the innocent rancher was also a murderer and a desperado, and he had stolen the ranch from somebody else, so gosh, I don't know. It was nothing but outlaws and desperados out here, so I guess it was kind of one of those things like all's fair in love and war. I guess that's just the way things were out here in those days. Men were men, and they settled arguments with a gun, and the women, well, the women didn't get much say in things. Anyway, another thing in defense of Longstreet's character is that he was also supposed to have been very kind to children, even though he never had any of his own. Throughout his life, he took in at least a few orphans, I think. A little black boy and a couple of Native Americans. And speaking of the Native Americans, he was apparently a pretty staunch friend and defender of the Native American tribes. I mean, living out here back then, there was hardly any white people in this area at all. So if you wanted to talk to anybody, well, you were going to have to talk to the local Paiute, I guess they were Paiute Nuuvi Native Americans. And so, well, not only did he befriend them, he actually learned how to speak their language. And I think he took at least 2 Native American wives. Although I guess technically it wasn't legal for a white man to marry a Native American woman back in those days. So, well, I guess he just kind of shacked up long term with a couple of Native American women. Whatever you want to call it, I guess he lived here in this cabin that we're about to check out at Ash Meadows with a woman named Susie. And then he was with a woman named Fanny for, gosh, decades, right up until the end of his life. And in fact, he and Fanny even raised a little Native American girl from the time she was really little all the way until she grew up. And I guess Fanny sounded like kind of a complicated woman. I mean, I'm sure life was not easy for a Paiute woman in this area at that time. I mean, yeah, this was the time of the closing of the American frontier. Well, you know what that meant for the Native Americans? It meant the end of their way of life. Like, they had been sort of forced into ever smaller corners of the country until finally even this last godforsaken patch of desert that nobody wanted became settled. And now, well, the Native Americans had, well, nowhere good to go. And I'm sure Fanny was feeling the effects of that, and her people were really suffering. And, well, she did some kind of questionable things. Like, well, her brother, first of all, was a notorious outlaw Indian murderer that, well, I guess she sort of talked her husband Jack into sheltering. So this outlaw hid out with them at one of their cabins for a few years. But then Jack ended up murdering him. And, well, I guess Fanny was kind of salty about that after that. So she was always kind of mean to the little Native American girl that they raised. I guess the little girl's name was Emma. And I don't know if Fanny was jealous of her, because Jack was really good with kids and he was really sweet on Emma, and he kind of spoiled Emma. In fact, he even bought Emma a car. Okay, that's what was so interesting about Jack Longstreet. The time period that he lived at the end of the frontier, late 1800s and the early 1900s, he bought his daughter a car, okay? He came into the area riding on a horseback prospecting, and he went out buying a Model T Ford for his fancy 1920s cloche hat and fur coat wearing daughter. Well, I guess Fanny was a little bit jealous about that, so when Jack Longstreet died, he never made a lot of money in his life, but I guess he did sell one of his ranches for a decent amount of money, and so he had some cash that he carried around in his suitcase because he never trusted banks, rightly so. Anyway, whatever money was left over, there was enough for Fanny to, I guess, live on for the rest of her life, but she wouldn't give Emma any of it. And all Emma wanted was, I think Emma wanted $500 so she could go to beauty school in L.A. I know, she wanted to go to beauty school in LA. That doesn't jibe with any of this old-timey stone cabin stuff that we're talking about, but that's what's so interesting about Jack Longstreet's life. He really bridged 2 eras. Anyway, I guess Emma, I don't know if she actually went to beauty school in LA, but she did eventually become a cosmetologist in Tonopah, and that's where she ended up dying. Okay, anyway, we're coming up on the famous Longstreet cabin. Now, this is the site of Jack Longstreet and I guess Susie Longstreet's original stone cabin here, but it's been rebuilt over the years by, I guess, the Park Service or whoever manages this place. So this isn't the original cabin, but this is pretty much what the original cabin would have looked like back in Jack Longstreet's day. Let's take a look inside. Okay, before we go inside, check this out. The cabin is built into the side of this, well, they call it a fossil spring mound. And what that means is, well, I guess when he scouted the site to build his cabin out here, well, first he looked for a spring, which you might be able to hear the sound of running water. Longstreet Spring right here. So he looked for the site of a spring, and then there was this fossil spring mound, which I guess means somehow these bushes grow up through the desert from the spring, and then the winds blow all these sand and dirt and mud, builds up around them and creates this mound, and then somehow the spring gets forced up through the mound. And well, he found this one mound that sort of already had a kind of a natural cave dug into the side of it, and so he used that cave and then built this stone cabin on the front of it as a means of sort of keeping cool, I guess. Because remember, we're just outside Death Valley. It gets hotter than blazes here in the summertime, and this was way, way, way before air conditioning or even swamp coolers. So he had to figure out a way that he wouldn't roast to death, and also a way that he could keep his food fresh. So I guess what he did was he built into the side of this spring mound and this hole here in the back wall. I don't think those boards would have been here back in the day because, well, from what I was able to read, I guess when Longstreet lived here, there was actually a trickle of water coming out of the side of the mound into the cabin. So I don't know why they built these boards up here, but he had a trickle of water that not only provided him drinking water, but it also made for a really cool environment back here where he could store like perishable foods. And then I guess presumably it kind of kept the rest of the cabin relatively cool, especially considering the rough living conditions out here in those days. This was probably a pretty nice place to live. Okay, let's go check out the spring. This is Longstreet Spring. The whole reason Longstreet wanted to build his cabin at this site in the first place is there was a beautiful, clear, fresh drinking water spring. Now, of course, it's all protected because of all these endangered species living in it, but look at that. It's a pretty big spring for the middle of the desert, especially when you consider the fact that we're not that far outside Death Valley. You know what I mean? There's just not a lot of water in these parts. And that's probably another reason why there was so much trouble between the white settlers and the Native Americans. There wasn't enough water to sustain everybody. But another thing in defense of Jack Longstreet's character is he was supposedly a pretty big defender of the Indians and their rights. I mean, not only did he have 2 Indian wives and raise that little Indian girl, well, I guess he really spent a lot of time defending the Native American tribe in this area because he'd become friendly with them. He learned how to speak their language. He would, lived among them. Well, at that time, I guess they were all sort of being forced into a reservation near the town of Mowapa, which is where there's a beautiful warm spring oasis. And it's actually where Longstreet had killed that rancher, Alexander Dry. That area is like one of the few lush, verdant places in this whole region where you could actually grow crops. I'm surprised that they were going to put the Native Americans on a reservation there, but they did. They made a little reservation, but apparently it was really being mismanaged by the guy who ran it. And so Jack Longstreet actually wrote to, I can't remember if he wrote to the state authorities or all the way to Washington. And well, by gum, the feds did send somebody out here to see what was going on, and they busted the guy and ran him out. So I guess that part about Jack Longstreet being a friend of the Indians on that plaque at the casino is somewhat accurate, at least. Okay, so aside from being a friend to the Indians and good with kids, Jack Longstreet was also weirdly kind of a friend of the law in a really weird way. I guess whenever there was a fugitive on the loose that they were trying to hunt down, Jack Longstreet was the first guy they called, or got a hold of. I guess they didn't have telephones back then, because he was an excellent man tracker and, well, he never missed his mark. And then apparently he also rode shotgun on the stagecoach line out of Tonopah. Now, I didn't realize this, but the term riding shotgun, like if you want to sit up front next to the driver, you go, I call shotgun. Well, I didn't realize that term comes from the fact that back in the stagecoach days, there used to be a guy who would sit up front next to the driver with a shotgun in case anybody tried to rob the stagecoach. Well, apparently, no one ever tried to rob any of the stagecoaches that Jack Longstreet was riding shotgun on. So it's not like he was evil. I mean, he was just a man of the times. I mean, in those days and in this part of the country, that's just the way it was, man. Every man for himself. I feel like Jack Longstreet was just one of them complicated figures who wasn't all good, and he wasn't all bad, not necessarily a bad hombre, and not necessarily a saint. He was complicated. And in fact, he seems to me like one of those historical personalities that Hollywood loves to make movies of. I mean, yeah, back in the golden age of Westerns in like the 1940s, 1950s, they could have made an amazing shoot-'em-up action film all about Jack Longstreet, last frontiersman of the desert. But nowadays, now that Hollywood's more into making sensitive character study type movies, well, I feel like Jack Longstreet is a really good character for one of them kind of movies too. You know what I mean? They made a movie about Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Well, where's Jack Longstreet's movie? And moreover, now that I think about it, where's Jack Longstreet's gun? You know, he had this famous long-barreled .44 that I guess was the custom back then to put a notch in the barrel or the handle, I guess the handle, of every person that you had killed. Kind of like today, how gangbangers in jail put that little teardrop tattoo under their eye for each person they've killed. Well, back in the day, them gunslingers used to put a notch on the butt of their rifle for each person they killed. And I guess Jack Longstreet supposedly had 5 notches on the barrel of his gun. Now, caveat, I don't think back then that gunslingers considered Mexicans or Indians as people, so he wouldn't have put any notches for any Mexicans or Indians that he killed. So that means, in addition to Alexander Dry, he apparently killed 4 other white men, and I don't know anything about them, and she didn't go into that in the book. But it sure would be interesting to see that gun. And, well, I went over to the Longstreet Casino before I started making this video to see if it was on display there. Because, I mean, the casino is named after Jack Longstreet, and the guy who built that casino, Jim Marsh, is a really well-known collector of local historical artifacts. And so I figure if anybody has Jack Longstreet's gun, it's probably Jim Marsh. But if he has it, it's not on display in the Longstreet Casino. Hey, Jim Marsh, if you happen to be watching this video, I'd love to see Jack Longstreet's gun. Call me. Anyway, you can actually go visit the grave of Jack Longstreet. He's buried up in the ghost town of Belmont, just northeast of Tonopah. I've actually been to Belmont, but I don't remember going to the cemetery and seeing his grave. Apparently what happened was, well, I think he was 93 years old, and he accidentally shot himself in the armpit. Woo! Live by the sword, die by the sword. Well, he accidentally shot himself, and the wound became infected, and he didn't want to stay in the hospital, so he went back to his little cabin up in the mountains, and the wound festered, and, well, he ended up dying in the miners' hospital in Belmont, and then they buried him right next door in the cemetery. So I'm definitely going to have to go up there and pay my respects sometime. Because that's what's so interesting to me personally about Jack Longstreet, is that he hung out in so many of the same places where I've made videos. I mean, the first written records of him place him in El Dorado Canyon, down on the Colorado River, near where I've kayaked to some of my favorite hot springs, and even shot some pictures for my calendar at the ghost town down there. And then he shot and killed that rancher to steal his property in the Moapa Valley, which is where I went to that beautiful warm springs complex that you're not allowed to swim in anymore because of the endangered Moapa dace. And then he lived for a time in St. Thomas, which was that ghost town that was flooded when they dammed the Colorado River to create Lake Mead. But now that Lake Mead is drying up, you can see the foundations coming up again. Then he operated a saloon in the mining town of Sylvania, where I explored an abandoned mill. And he spent the last years of his life not too far from Cooter Canyon, which is where I went looking for all those vagina petroglyphs. And of course, he died in Belmont, and I made a video there too. So I feel a real kinship with Jack Longstreet, whether he was a bad hombre or a Robin Hood of the desert. He was complicated, just like all of us.